Hello all and a very warm welcome. Just wanted to do a very quick video today talking about what we can surmise here from the authentic and inauthentic view today, Gospels, Acts, Epistles and so on. And so it gives us an idea of exactly how hard it is to trace any lines back to an historical, gospel narrative or an historical ministry. So we're just going to go through that very quickly to show how there was so much conflation with, I think, early Christianities and their books, and how the attempts here, the obvious attempts to harmonize different accounts that were conducted by the church fathers really show us how difficult it was for them to work out what was true and what was not. And we're only talking here, the mid-2nd to, say, 3rd centuries. The mid-100s to 200s and so on. This is outside of the time where we can trace anyone back to the events themselves. And it's just really hard. And I can see why, various early Christians were talking about and referencing texts that were not included in the official canon that came out of Nicaea. So we're just going to go through a few of them now. And I think it helps serve to bolster this notion that there's no credible way of discerning a history here. Everything comes too late. And the panoply of different Gnostic and Christian sects that come out of the 2nd century with all of their different documents, some of them being conflated with official documents, just serves to show, I think, that even the gospel traditions have had conflated different stories, different narratives in their traditions. John is a good example of this, which is not, again, like the Synoptics, and is probably, most likely now written in stages. The John we now have being interpolated into and changed at least a couple of times before we get John, the proper John Gospel. And of course it was prized by, as I've said many times, Gnostics. Like Valentinus. So the introduction here is: the history of the New Testament canon is often told as though the early church knew from the start which books were authentic and which were not. In reality, the majority of Christian writings circulating in the first few centuries were either later rejected, exposed as forgeries, or dropped from serious consideration. And now, what we now call the New Testament, 27 books, of course, represents a small core that survived centuries of debate, suppression, and shifting judgments of authenticity. So, the Gospels, from many to 4. Okay, today's Christianity rests on 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, yet dozens of others were once read, quoted, and treated as authoritative in different Christian communities. The Gospel of the Hebrews was cited by Jerome and Clement of Alexandria. It's quite Gnostic. Talks about Sophia. Gospel of the Egyptians circulated among sects such as the Sabellians. Gospel of Thomas was revered in Syria and Egypt. The Gospel of Peter was read publicly in churches until Bishop Serapion denounced it. By the 4th century, all of these were condemned as inauthentic. Out of perhaps 30 or more Gospels, only 4 remained. Acts, a proliferation of apostolic legends. The canonical Acts of the Apostles was far from unique. A whole literature of apostolic adventures circulated. The Acts of Paul and Thecla was so popular that some congregations read it in worship. Tertullian reports that it was exposed as a forgery. Acts of Peter, Andrew, Thomas, John, each offered miracle tales and martyrdom stories, shaping later Christian imagination. Okay, and none of these survived canonization. They were eventually branded as fictions or heretical works, despite their early use. Epistles, even canonical letters, are dubious. Okay, even the canonical letters are now deemed dubious. Let's see if you remember any. The epistles are perhaps the most striking case where the lines between authentic and spurious are blurred. Of the 13 letters traditionally attributed to Paul, modern scholars accept only 7 as genuinely Pauline. The rest, Ephesians, Colossians, 2 Thessalonians, 1 and 2 Timothy, and Titus, are considered pseudonymous. And there are even, going back quite a long way here, people that say only 4 now are attributable to one person, Paul, this person we call Paul. And today's modern analyses using text stylometry and so on, and word usage and grammar are actually saying no, it is actually a lot more like 4. Many of them were written by different people, and we can't place them really in history until Irenaeus gives us the official canon there with the 13 letters in 180-ish. So 2 Peter is widely recognized as a forgery, though it entered the canon in the 4th century. Other letters such as 1 Clement, Barnabas, Shepherd of Amass, were revered as scripture in some churches and included in early canons like the Codex Sinaiticus, of course, including the Shepherd of Amass. Nothing to do with Christianity, really. Thus, even within the New Testament itself, several works once thought genuine are now regarded as fake or misattributed. The Apocalypses and Revelations, this class of literature. John's Apocalypse is the sole survivor in the New Testament, but it was one among many. The Apocalypse of Peter was accepted in the Muratorian canon and quoted as scripture by Clement of Alexandria. The Shepherd of Amass was treated as inspired by Irenaeus and Origen, and included in the Codex Sinaiticus, as I said. Other apocalypses of Paul, of Thomas, Stephen fell into disrepute. Church orders and teachings, another important class of literature here. A number of didactic texts hovered on the edges of the canon. The Didache, done a video on this one. Teaching of the 12 apostles was quoted as scripture by some and listed by Athanasius among the books useful for instruction. Of course, Eusebius rejects it. First Clement was read in Corinth as scripture well into the 4th century. Both were later dropped, leaving the canon slimmer. Okay, conclusion. The minority that survived, if we tally the record, the majority of early Christian writings, once treated as authoritative, are now rejected. The final canon represents not an obvious consensus, but the survival of a small minority of works after centuries of contestation. Moreover, modern scholarship has shown that even within the canon, some letters are pseudonymous and some attributions are false. Of course, the irony is stark. Christianity's authentic scriptures are outnumbered perhaps 4-1 by texts once held sacred but now dismissed as fake. What we call the New Testament is not the natural fruit of divine preservation, but the remnant of a much larger and more chaotic field of writings, most of which the church itself has had to brand as inauthentic. Okay, so I'll basically just leave that there. What can we conclude? Yes, well, it's all about this question between what came first, the canonical stories in the primal, pristine, together, consistent format here, or whether it was actually a hell of a lot of different things going on. Of course, we know that the earliest Christians really took their Jesus from Old Testament scriptures and worked in a few, like logos, notions here of the logos, say, which came from Greco-Rome. And there's obviously a confusion, and we see by the time the Gospels come along, there is some kind of clearer format for what the historical Jesus really did and what that constituted. the first elements here are far more Gnostic, and of course are far wider in the early Christian world than what came probably much more likely later on. So it's really about this whole what's the shift here, and I can't wait to read Richard Carrier's book on this, because he's saying that many of the early Christians through the church fathers are basically saying, look, this notion of an historical Jesus, that's not what we teach. We don't see this. Where is he? What did he say? Why are you trying to correct our more pristine texts here? Why are you interpolating into them? And this definitely happened. So, peace and love, I guess. We'll be back soon. All right, cool.